morning to all of you. It's a good evening here in Vancouver on a lovely balmy summer night. As Johan said, I am a former federal prosecutor here in Canada. I prosecuted mostly environmental offenses, and they included offenses on international trade in wildlife under CITES, or under the Canadian legislation that incorporates CITES. And it included prosecutions of, among other things, illegal trade in African elephant ivory. I lived in Tanzania and Kenya as a girl, and although I left, my heart didn't, and I get back to Africa as often as I possibly can. And I'm very involved and interested in conservation work. My talk tonight I've entitled Tusks, Treaties and Trials: International Illegal Wildlife Trade and the Global Efforts to Stop It. So we'll start by looking at what is international wildlife crime. There is no universal definition or no universal treaty that defines international wildlife crime. Therefore, there's no accepted definition, but it can be defined basically as illegal wildlife trade or international wildlife crime being the sale or exchange of any wild animal or plant or parts of them which is contrary to law. This poor little fellow here is a slow lemur caught illegally in Myanmar. Now, some aspects of the illegal wildlife trade, first of all, it's big business. It's very big business. In 2017, the meeting of the G20 states put out a declaration that the illegal wildlife trade is worth an estimated somewhere between 8 to 20 billion euro, which means $9 to $22 billion US annually. And it's because of the high demand, it's one of the largest and most profitable forms of organized cross-border crime, according to the G20. It's also been estimated that it's the fourth largest illegal global trade, behind only narcotics, counterfeiting, and human trafficking. Second, the World Wildlife Federation states that the illegal wildlife trade is the second biggest threat to biodiversity on the planet after habitat loss. Third, it can impact human health through zoonotic diseases, and we're all very familiar with that concept. But according to the World Health Organization, around 75% of new or emerging infectious diseases that have affected humans over the last decade originates in animals. And of course, when you get illegally trafficked wild species, they by definition escape any kind of hygiene or sanitary controls, so it poses even greater risks of infection. And last, illegal wildlife is increasingly being run by big organized crime syndicates. And the reason it's attractive to them is because of the huge profit margins, in many cases higher than illicit drugs. And just to give you an indication of this, now unfortunately this data is from Canada, it's the best I could get, but it just gives you an idea of what the value is in international wildlife crime. Bear bile, or the sale of bear bile in Canada per kilogram, costs more than heroin, meth, cocaine, and other drugs, opium, hash, and marijuana. And you can see the relative prices of drugs and some of the wild species that are traded in Canada. The most amazing is this one gyrfalcon, which is used in falconry in Middle East countries, can fetch $360,000 for one live species, which is more than twice the amount of a kilogram of heroin. So let's look at some of these species, the ones that are being trafficked most, either because they have the most numbers or that they're generating the most income. And we start with elephants. It's the one that's the poster child for illegal wildlife trade, but it also has an illicit annual income between 310, sorry, let me get these numbers straight. Between 2016 and 2018, it was estimated that the illegal income just for those 2 years from ivory, the trade in ivory, was about US $230 million. Now, depending on the source, there are estimates that between 20,000 and 35,000 African elephants are killed each year just for their ivory. That's estimated by the World Wildlife Federation. And the IUCN, don't worry too much about all these abbreviations. You're going to get links to them all. But the IUCN is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature that puts out the red list of which species are most threatened. Intense poaching for elephant ivory is the biggest cause for the elephant's decline, although of course habitat loss and human-elephant conflict are also a part. The World Wildlife Federation estimates that in 1930, there were as many as 10 million elephants roaming Africa. And according to a 2016 count by the IUCN, there were only about 415,000 left. Now, depending in 1989, the international trade in elephant ivory was banned, and numbers in some areas started to increase. Poaching decreased. But by 2011, the group called Traffic, which is a trade monitoring group, which is a partnership between WWF and the IUCN, recorded the worst year for poaching since the ban took place in 1999. Some groups believe that the increase might have been caused in part by a one-off legal sale of ivory through stockpiles that had accumulated through natural mortalities and game management. And there were 2 of these one-off sales, one in 1999 and 2008, despite the complete ban in 1989. Others attribute this increase in poaching in by 2016 more to an increase in demand from a growing middle class in China that can now afford ivory. But according to some environmental groups, the legal trade drove an illegal trade and the resumption of large-scale poaching. And in fact, investigators from the Environmental Investigation Agency, which is an NGO, found that by 2016, as much as 90% of the ivory for sale in China was black market ivory. And other NGOs, such as the report by the African Wildlife Foundation and Wild Aid on the trade of ivory in Hong Kong, came to the same conclusion, that the legal trade was being used as a cover for illegal smuggling. Now, many more countries have banned internal ivory trade, and I'm hoping that poaching of elephants will decrease again. These lovely creatures were near Chobe in Botswana. And I apologize for the video. The reason there's no attribution of whose video it is because it's mine and it's not very good, but I still love these creatures. Most of the illegally obtained ivory is simply for decoration, which is horrific when you think about it. It's for trinkets, jewelry, statues, and then the occasional odd item like this elephant stool, which was seized by Canadian officials. And of course, we've got rhinos. And the annual illegal income generated from rhino horn trafficking in the 2 years between 2016 and 2018 was estimated at US $230 million by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. Rhino poaching is driven almost exclusively by the demand for the horn. It's used as a traditional medicine and an aphrodisiac, but also more and more increasingly, it's simply being used as a status symbol to own the horn in the form of carvings, cups, figurines, and jewelry. But as we all know, rhino horn is simply made of keratin, the same as in horses' hooves and human fingernails. Now, the previous picture is I believe a white rhino. Somebody can correct me. It's from the Save Valley Conservancy in Zimbabwe. And these are some black rhinos from Ngorongoro in Tanzania. And then we get the pangolin. The pangolin have been called the most trafficked mammal at all. In 2019, there were an estimated 195,000 pangolins trafficked for their scales alone, according to WWF. They're in high demand in countries like China and in Vietnam. Their meat is considered a delicacy, but mostly they're trafficked for their scales, which are used in traditional medicine and in folk remedies. But again, like the rhino horn, it's simply keratin. It's the same substance that's in our own fingernails. Sharks. Between about 73 to 100 million sharks are slaughtered every year, mostly just for their fins. There is some shark meat trade, but it's almost all the fins alone. Not all of the trade is illegal, but shark fin trading is illegal in many countries. Sadly, when they're caught, their fins are hacked off, and then most of them are simply thrown back into the ocean while they're still alive, where they can die slowly by drowning or by bleeding to death. And in the upper right-hand picture, you'll see some shark fins that have been cut off the shark that are drying. Those were from Macau in China. You get tigers. There's not a large number of tigers being illegally taken for the illegal poaching and trade. However, they're worth a lot. A single tiger pelt or body can bring a lot of money. They're used for medicines. The bones in particular are used for medicines, but more and more people want their furs and their trophies. There's only about 3,900 tigers remaining in the wild, and the low numbers in the wild have resulted in illegal captive breeding or tiger farms, where they're often bred in just deplorable conditions. Bears. Bears are killed for meat, but more often bear paws and gallbladders are used for medicine, and live bears are traded and caged for bile extraction. You get turtles, but they're poached for their meat and traded for their meat as pets and for their shells. And there's many other reptile species also illegally traded: snakes, lizards, alligators, crocodiles. And birds. There's a huge illegal trade in birds. They're traded live, mostly for pets by collectors or for bird fighting and sports such as falconry. Occasionally, they're eaten as delicacies, the ortolan bunting in France, although it's now been banned. Just to give you an example of the proportion of what gets seized illegally, and we assume probably similar proportions of what is being taken illegally. This pie chart shows you some data that I took from the UNODC, which is United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, their World Wildlife Crime Report in 2020, and at the end of this deck, there will be a link to that report. Interestingly, plants make up a large amount of it, and I have found out that that's mostly wood and includes things like rosewood and agar wood, which is used to make incense and perfumes. Let's look briefly at some of the historical attempts that there were to regulate the wildlife trade. The first significant agreement on wildlife protection was in 1900 at the London Convention for the Preservation of Wild Animals, Birds, and Fish. It sounds like a laudable purpose until you look at what the long name of the convention was. And the long name was the Convention Designed to Ensure the Conservation of Various Species of Wild Animals in Africa, which are useful to man or inoffensive. And it was signed by the countries that were colonial powers in Africa. And those are listed there on the right. One of the groundbreaking features, though, of the 1900 convention was that it used schedules which placed animals in different categories of protection. And this is the model that's still used today in conservation-related treaties. However, I think today we'd find some of the categories and the animals placed in them questionable. For example, it includes a prohibition on hunting giraffes, gorillas, and chimpanzees due to their thought rarity, and vultures and owls due to their usefulness. I don't know what the usefulness was, possibly as carrion or vermin eaters, Elephants and rhinos could be hunted, except for mothers and young. And it also encouraged hunting animals that were designated as harmful and, in their mind, needed to be reduced in numbers, including lions, leopards, African wild dogs, pythons, and poisonous snakes. It also, for the first time, required hunting licenses and creation of export duties on animal hides, tusks, and antlers, which makes me wonder if that was where the origin of the first illegal trade started, when people tried to avoid the requirement for hunting licenses and duties. Also, strangely, it seems to us now, it required the parties to take measures to encourage the domestication of zebras, elephants, and ostriches. This zebra photo, it was taken sometime between 1890 and 1923, and it looks to me like the zebra is certainly winning. And zebras have never been properly domesticated, never been domesticated at all. They were smarter than that, I'd like to think. Then the First World War happened and its aftermath, and it wasn't until 1933 that the colonial powers in Africa got around to getting another convention. And this was called the Convention Relative to Preservation of Fauna and Flora in Their Natural State. Unlike the previous convention, which I should say never actually got ratified because not all of the parties signed it, but this convention did get ratified because it only required 4 ratifications to come into force. So it did actually come into force in 1936. It obligated the signatories to prohibit or regulate hunting of certain species, to establish parks and reserves, to regulate trophy trafficking, and to prohibit unsportsmanlike methods of hunting. So although it did address some aspects of international trade in what it called trophies, which included rhino horn and elephant tusks, its real objective was to preserve the future supplies of species which had economic value. For example, trophy hunting, which brought in a lot of money into the colonial coffers. But what the 1933 conference did do was pave the way to more discussion, and more discussion particularly on institutionalizing conservation, which led to the creation of the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, in 1948, which now has over 1,400 members, including 160 countries, and it undertakes worldwide conservation projects and keeps, as I mentioned, the red list of threatened species. In 1960, at the IUCN General Assembly, delegates were expressing concern over the threatened status of a lot of species, and they urged governments to restrict imports of animals. This brought the realization that some countries often didn't know other countries' regulations and certainly didn't know what the threat was to species in other countries. So to resolve this problem in 1963, the IUCN called for the creation of a new treaty to regulate international trade in wildlife. It took another 8 years, almost 9 years, but in 1972, at a United Nations conference on the human environment, the UN recommended that a conference be convened as soon as possible to prepare and adopt a convention on the export, import, and transit of certain species of wild animals and plants. And that served as the basis for negotiations that culminated in 1973, and the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, CITES, was born. Now, CITES, as I said, was signed in March 1973. It entered into force on July 1st, 1975. It is a global binding agreement, and it ensures, or tries to ensure, the goal is to ensure that trade in protected species is legal, sustainable, and traceable. And countries that are a party to CITES must have legislation in place to implement and enforce all of the aspects of the convention. There's not enough that the CITES parties have to adopt the necessary legislation. It's got to be kept up to date, and it's got to be properly enforced. The compliance is done primarily through trade suspensions. The South African legislation that implements and enforces CITES is called the National Environmental Management Biodiversity Act Regulations, CITES. And I know that Jacques du Toit is going to be speaking about that in more detail. and how he manages to use that in the prosecution of illegal wildlife trade. Now, CITES has 184 parties. There are 183 countries, plus the EU is also a member. There are very few countries that have not signed on to it. As you can see by this map, the only countries that haven't are the ones in white. There are about 196 countries in the world. That changes, and 183 of them have signed on to CITES. Once they've signed on, a state or a party can withdraw from the convention at any time, but it's only happened once in the history of CITES. And the United Arab Emirates joined CITES in 1974 at the beginning. It withdrew in 1998, but then came back and became a party in the convention again on 9th of May, 1990. The way CITES works is that species are listed in 3 appendices of varying degrees of protection. Currently, there are over 38,000 species. That's approximately 5,900 animals and over 32,000 plants. Now, Appendix 1, which only makes up 3% of the listed species on CITES, but those are species where commercial trade is almost always prohibited. There are very few exceptions. Appendix 2 is species that are not necessarily threatened with extinction, but trade has to be controlled to ensure their survival. So international trade is allowed, but strictly controlled. And it also includes some lookalike species that are those which look like those listed for conservation reasons. Appendix 3 are species that are protected in at least one country, and that country or countries has asked other CITES parties for assistance in controlling their trade. In Appendix 1, there's a picture of a chimpanzee. All great apes are on Appendix 1. Picture of a bear, which is in Appendix 2. Most of them are in Appendix 2. And this Appendix 3 is a 2-toed sloth, which was listed by Costa Rica. And the middle picture is an American black bear. The CITES Conference of the Parties is the way it actually, the nitty-gritty of it works. You can see here a list of all of the conferences there have been since the first one in 1976. This is where discussions and votes take place on what species will be listed, possible sanctions, and other matters. And it includes representatives from each party country. The conferences are held every 2 to 3 years, and they try not to have a meeting in the same country more than once, although it has been held in Switzerland 3 times. The home base is in Geneva, Switzerland. It's been hosted 4 times in Africa, in Botswana, Zimbabwe, Kenya, and South Africa. Now, I'm not going to talk too much more about CITES. There is some good educational information about how it works, and you'll have links to that at the end of this talk. But I just want to mention briefly that CITES is not alone, although it's the only international treaty or the international mechanism we have. It doesn't work alone. It has help. And in 2010, there was an international consortium on combating wildlife crime formed, and it's made up of CITES itself, Interpol, which is the international police, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, the World Bank, and the World Customs Organization. And in addition to the ICCWC, there are some others. There's wildlife enforcement networks and what's called TWIX networks. TWIX networks are a trade in wildlife information exchange networks. There's one for the EU, there's one for Southern Africa or the CADC, and others. Cooperation in prosecutions, as Charles will be able to say, is absolutely essential. You might need information or a search warrant from another country to prosecute under CITES in whatever country you're in. I'm going to give you an example. And one of my prosecutions was of an ivory importer coming into Canada, importing ivory into here in Vancouver. He showed up at the airport to claim his packages, which had been shipped to him from Hong Kong. A routine inspection had found a large amount of elephant ivory in the packages. He claimed that he had no idea the packages contained ivory, and the manifest that came with them listed the item as cow bone carvings. But with help from Hong Kong officials and Interpol, we obtained surveillance video of the shipping office in Hong Kong, which clearly showed the man shipping the parcels to himself. Another example of international cooperation was a prosecution I did involving endangered coral from the Philippines. There is a big trade in endangered coral. For some reason, it's a big status symbol to have this in your saltwater fish tank. But in this case, again, the recipient said that it must have been a mistake, that the shipper must have sent the wrong corals. So officials in the Philippines got a search warrant for the shipper's computer and actually found the emails verifying that both the shipper and the receiver here in Canada intended to ship and receive illegal coral. Now, what I really want to get to is some of the inherent limitations and other limitations of CITES. Is it working? One of the biggest inherent limitations is that it's only a trade agreement. It applies to flora and fauna that is traded internationally. It's got no direct application to poaching and illegal domestic trade. That's up to each country to regulate itself. Well, that's not a failing of the convention itself. It's simply outside of its scope and intention. There's also the problem that there are millions of species that aren't listed by CITES. It's restricted by the appendix listing system. So species not on it aren't afforded any protection by that convention. For example, there's a lot of illegal timber trade of species that are not on CITES. And even if some species are endangered, and in some cases even due to wildlife trafficking, they're not covered by CITES. To give you an example, only 8% of the world's known reptile species are listed, despite reported trade in the skins of many non-listed reptiles, including all crocodile skink species, for an example. And this issue is compounded by the fact that the listing of species in CITES appendices can be driven by political rather than scientific processes and interstate negotiations over inclusion or non-inclusion of certain species. The other limitation and problem with CITES, or one other, is that it has little conservation value where wildlife trade is not the key threat. For many species listed on CITES, the main threats are not the illegal international wildlife trade. Rather, they're issues like habitat loss, civil unrest, illegal hunting for subsistence, and climate change, which is a big one. So a country could push to get an endangered species listed on CITES to make it look like they're doing something about conservation, but they're not actually addressing the cause. Let me give you an example. Giraffa camelopardalis, which is the northern giraffe, including all 9 subspecies, are listed in Appendix 2 of CITES, but there's very little international trade in giraffe products. So arguably, its inclusion on CITES will have little effect on its conservation. Another problem with CITES, or limitation, is that there is such a thing called reservations. States or parties to CITES can enter reservations to certain species being included in an appendix if it finds that the party if the party finds the listing of the species unacceptable. It's usually due to the reserving country having an economic or trading interest in the species that, in their opinion, overrides conservation value. And a notable example of reservations include those by Japan, Norway, and Iceland with regard to certain species of whales. Each of these countries maintains whaling operations for particular species for commercial export and scientific purposes, and it objects to the restrictions that are otherwise imposed by CITES. So the reservation mechanism on CITES can be criticized as weakening the convention, and that's probably true. But there's another argument that it can also function as a way of encouraging membership into the convention by states who maybe wouldn't otherwise have acceded to it. problem is that there are inconsistent penalties in different countries. CITES doesn't prescribe any particular penalties for infractions. This means that in some countries, trafficking in CITES-listed species is punished with a fine, while in others, offenders can be sentenced to time in prison. And this is despite the fact that the CITES Conference of the Parties has urged countries to advocate sanctions for infringements that are appropriate to their nature and gravity. But in fact, the penalties for offenses under domestic law vary greatly. Some countries, as I said, are much more inclined to sanction with just a fine, while in others, offenders can be sentenced to more than 4 years in prison. And there's always a problem of corruption and abuse of the permit system. Any trade in a CITES-listed species requires a permit, and that system relies on proper compliance by the issuing parties. Unfortunately, there are examples of non-compliance, with various states issuing permits improperly, having been reported. And it includes things like corrupt officials, improper record keeping, document theft, permit forgery, permit modification, and incomplete reporting by countries on the actual amount of trade of species and the effect on its conservation. All of this negatively affects the permit system and the efficacy of CITES itself. And we get to sanctions. As I mentioned, the only real enforcement action that CITES has is trade sanctions or threat of them. The CITES parties, other CITES parties may agree not to trade with a non-compliant party, either in a particular species or in any CITES-listed species. Since many of the CITES listings are quite broad, including lookalike species, they potentially have serious economic consequences, but the sanctions are not often used, and when they are, the results are mixed. For example, in 2013, CITES threatened Thailand with sanctions to encourage it to clean up its illegal ivory market, and Thailand did. The amount of ivory in Bangkok's markets dropped by about 96% between 2014 and 2016. But in contrast, around the same time period, Laos was issued a trade ban when it failed to file reports on its progress to combat the illegal ivory trade. But Laos then appeased CITES with a written national ivory action plan, and CITES lifted the trade ban, even though illegal ivory and many other protected species are still openly sold there. Another problem is it's up to the conference of the parties in their meetings to decide who should be sanctioned, and powerful countries such as China can influence less powerful parties. So it makes you wonder, if CITES seldom bites, is it worth it? Well, I'd answer it's all we've got. And the reality is that most countries take their CITES obligations seriously, and they don't need sanctions to comply. There's also procedural challenges in prosecutions. Trials are expensive, they take resources. Other customs and other law enforcement personnel have to be trained. It can be difficult determining the differences between illegal and legal species and determining the origin of a product. When it's hard or difficult to verify the source of a specimen, then laundering becomes a significant problem, and that is that the legal and the illegal products are mixed. The reality is that CITES works best on Appendix 1 species, where there is a complete ban. In anything else, you get the mixing of legal and illegal trade, and it can be very difficult to verify which is which. So this leaves us with the big question, and this is the question I want to leave with you today. Is CITES sufficient to combat international wildlife crime? Or do you think that there should be a new regime for combating wildlife crime within the framework of some kind of binding international criminal law rather than trade law? I can tell you that one expert says yes. John Scanlon, whose name is probably familiar to many of you, he is the special envoy for Africa, the African Parks Network. Before joining African Parks, he was the Secretary General of CITES between 2010 and 2018. My opinion, despite its flaws and its problems, CITES does work. I've seen it work. I've prosecuted under it. But I also think it would probably be better to have a mechanism under international criminal law. But I wonder whether the international, or whether the resources and the global political will to create a whole new international framework could be impossible to muster. And if you want a link to where John Scanlon speaks about this issue, and he makes the case for having a new regime within international criminal law, the link is down at the bottom of this slide where he gave that interview. So I'm going to leave you with that question. And the last are just some further reading and resources, which I believe Marit will probably put up in the chat. And they're available on this deck. And I highly recommend some of these for further reading. There are some excellent materials, particularly on the CITES and the UNODC websites, including a virtual college and some online training courses, which are very interesting. And that's the end of my part of the presentation. I'd like to turn it over now to Jacques du Toit.
All right. Morning. Thank you, everybody. As has been mentioned, apologies, as has been mentioned, my name is Jacques du Toit. I'm with the National Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment. Quick background of myself, I actually studied at TUT. I studied nature conservation there and extremely proud of it. And wishing everybody else of you that that studies there currently all the best, and to tell you that you can make a huge difference, and it's up to you whether you want to or not. So with that, I just wanted to say that before I joined the National Department, I worked in a unit called Special Investigation, where I did criminal investigations on the topic that Jane presented on, first on CITES. So I investigated those cases, and thank you, Jane, for that presentation. Took me back to the years where I arrested people and went to court, a very exciting time. But currently I'm responsible for capacity development of our law enforcement officials in South Africa, specifically on conservation law and environmental legislation. And that was what I was asked for to present on this morning. So conservation and from a domestic environmental legislative perspective. And what I'm going to be doing is basically using this kind of a layout. So I took something that I think most of you would be a lot more familiar. When we start speaking law, so many times people's eyes start rolling back in their head and they kind of switch off because it can become a bit difficult to understand and tedious. So I thought, let me start with this and explain it this way. So the scenario here is a normal bumper bashing. Two vehicles drove into each other. So there's certain headings like who are you, what's the legislation, and in this instance we're talking about the Road Traffic Act, you know, how fast you must drive, may drive, following distances. What's the activity that we're covering here? It's basically the accident. What is it that we're talking about? Well, it's two vehicles. And what the consequence? Well, the law says you need to register, you need to share, exchange details. You might want to go to court to claim damages, etc. So this is kind of the basis on which I'll present domestic conservation legislation, specifically in South Africa. And just to remind you, or just to introduce the fact that I'm not going to do it justice, the legislation. I'm just going to leave a lot of information out and focus on the main areas, the principles. So we're going to be looking at the national biodiversity legislation for South Africa, and then also touch on some of the roles as a ranger or as a conservationist, as somebody that might one day work in a park or a protected area. So the scenario is there's your nature reserve, range of species occurring there. It doesn't matter the size of the protected area or the nature reserve, or your game farm, or whatever the thing is that you are working at, where you're working. And on this farm, on this reserve, you witness the following. You detect snares, as you can see the top left. There's an encampment from people that you do not know. You came across that camp. There's some meat being dried in the sun, and then you find a vehicle with what looks like some plants. Okay. So now thinking of that first basis, as I said, as the vehicle accident, traffic accident. Let's look at this. Who are you? Are you private, or are you government, or are you the poacher? All right. So for purposes of my presentation, I'm going to assume none of you are poachers. If you are, please pay attention to the last couple of slides where I speak about offenses and penalties. But for now, let's just say none of you are going to venture in that side. So if you're private, you might be private security on a reserve. So the field ranger, you might be the owner, management. If you're government, are you an environmental management inspector, or do you work for the police service? All right. So with that said, let me quickly just do a very quick overview of what is an environmental management inspector. It's this badge on my jacket, and what it basically boils down to is, in South Africa, you are designated as an EMI when you work for an environmental institution, either conservation, national, provincial government, or even local government. And the logo basically implies, or it's got three colors. It's got brown, blue, and green. Brown being illegal activities relating to development, pollution, waste, etc. Blue meaning our marine and coastal environment, and then green, biodiversity and conservation. All right. And the role of the EMI is identical to that of a police official, with the main difference that we may only focus on environmental crime. Okay, so we investigate these cases, we gather evidence, we build case dockets, we liaise with prosecutors, and we go to court. All right, so we're also known as the green scorpions, if you guys have ever heard of that. Okay, so what we're going to look at now, remember that scenario that I shown you. So relevant to that, in a country you will have legislation. Jane spoke about CITES, which is an international convention. She also referenced the fact that a country then needs to make their own internal legislation to meet the obligations of CITES. Okay, now lots of words, lots of principles, but let's see it as in this way. Remember the Road Traffic Act, it says how fast you can drive, it says what you must do, stop at the robot, what is a three-way stop parallel, you know, have your vehicle license renewed, you must have a license to drive, etc. Now, similarly for conservation, there are legislation that manages it. In South Africa, we've got the National Environmental Management Act, and then the Biodiversity Act, together with a legislation, a regulation that speaks about threatened or protected species, and then National Environmental Management Protected Areas Act that speaks and manages protected areas in the country, and then we've got provincial conservation. So there's a national legislation for the whole country, but then each province where they have specific species that they want to, in addition, protect, they can have their own legislation. All right, so just to give you a sense. Okay, so what does all of this mean? Was there anything wrong in the scenario? All right, so we have to start there. So if we look at those two images, we saw some meat and we saw some plants. Now we need to figure out, is anything going wrong? Is anybody breaking the law? So there's a thing called, there's a section called 56. It speaks about listed species. Now, all that this means is in South Africa, there's a list that will divide species on critically endangered, vulnerable, and protected. Okay, and the minister of the country may proclaim or gazette these. All right, so let's go further. In legislation, and this is where it sometimes gets difficult for the general person to understand law. And as soon as you say law, people, as I say, they get anxious. They don't understand. But I'm going to try and simplify. All right. So if we look at the legislation, it says there's things called definitions in the beginning of law, and there's a definition for species, specimen, and derivative. And basically, I'm not going to read all of this. Basically, what it means is any kind of animal, plant, or other organism, living or dead, all right, or any derivative, and a derivative is any part thereof. Now, okay, why do they say that? Because you can see there's that meat. We don't know yet what species it is, but are we going to say, well, by law, there's nothing wrong with it because it's not the actual animal standing there, it's a part thereof. And that's why the law then says, no, wait a minute. When a species is listed, any part thereof, whether processed, genetic material, all of that is similarly protected. All right, very important. And the same with the plants. There you can see there, the plants, they don't have roots, they don't have leaves. So what's going on there? But yet, because of its derivatives and parts thereof, it's covered. So now we go further. We get these exhibits or evidence analyzed, and we can see the meat at the top there. Some of the meat belongs to an impala, and some of the meat belongs to an oribi. And at the bottom, the plant that we saw there is a Mujaji cycad, all right, Encephalartos transvenosus. So there you can see, all right, so now we've got the species name. Now, what does that mean? Well, all of these species, remember I said legislation, there can be lists attached to it. Similar to, as Jane explained, with CITES, Appendix 1, 2, and 3. In our domestic legislation, we also have lists. So these species, luckily for us in our scenario, is listed. So it does, they do receive protection in terms of South African legislation. All right, so what does it mean? Somebody needs to do something in order for us to say that they broke the law. So again, we go look at the legislation. It speaks about restricted activities involving listed, threatened, or protected species and species to which international agreement. Now that latter part that speaks to and international agreement speaks amongst others to CITES. But the first part speaks about restricted activities involving listed protected species. And that implies within South Africa, within the borders of our country. And it goes further by saying a person may not carry out a restricted activity involving a specimen of listed or threatened protected species without a permit. Okay, so now in terms of law, there's something that says there's certain things you can't do with certain species that is listed if you don't have a permit. You require a permit to do it. Okay, so let's go on. Restricted activity. What does that mean? So again, we go look what the law says. Law there says restricted activity implies, amongst others, a lot of things. You can see there, I've underlined some hints there for you. So if you look at hunting, catching, capturing, killing, with the intent to hunt, catch, capture, or kill, to gather, collect, pluck, uproot, chop, cut, pick, possess, exercise, physical control, convey, moving, translocating, and for instance, camping outside a demarcated area. So all of these things, now remember, says you need a permit to undertake a restricted activity. All right, and so we've identified our species. We saw they were impala and oribi and cycads. Now, some of these activities, just based on the scenario, camping outside a demarcated area is one. Do they have permission to camp there? All right, even though this might be a poacher's camp, an overnight camp, the activity of camping is still regulated, no matter what you were doing there. All right, so that's one of the points. Hunting, now snare, you just found a snare, but it's an active device whatsoever to either hunt or kill. All right, or catch or kill. So there's your other activity they had in their possession. You can see there the meat. The plants also, you can also say they have in their possession, but also think about uprooting, damaging, and destroying. Okay, why you would say all of these are important, and hopefully that will become a little bit clearer in a second. All right, again, all of these activities, as I've already shown you, are actually listed, and you require a permit or authorization to do so. Okay. Now, in the absence of a permit, everything that you've done would be illegal, but it's only illegal if the law says it's illegal. Now, remember that one at the beginning says that you may not conduct certain activities without a permit. If the legislation stopped there and it said you may not do it, but you do it, then there's no consequence if anybody catches you. The law needs to give you a consequence. And what's the consequence? Well, it's an offense. It says that you are guilty of an offense if you contravene that's section 57. Now, 57 is the one that speaks about all the activities. And if you then are found guilty in a court of law, then there's penalties. And our penalties indicates that it's either a fine of 10 million or imprisonment of 10 years, or both such a fine and imprisonment. And if it's if it starts getting where you have a number of endangered species or whatever your activities was, and there's a lot of black market trade, etc., we could go for a 3 times commercial value, where 10 million isn't sufficient to cover or isn't a sufficient punishment. Okay, so pretty serious. But what you must realize now is that everything we've just done up until this point is a book exercise, is a paper exercise. We've just identified that there are crimes that were committed and that there's punishment associated with it. But other than that, you haven't done anything. So what's your role? Again, we're going to have to ask, who are you? Are you private or are you government? If you're private, you have certain obligations, you have certain rights that you can do. You have to obviously write down all your observations. You've got information that might be critical to the investigation. You are most likely going to be what we call a first responder to a crime scene. In other words, what you do there is fundamentally important because you're first there. You also have to notify law enforcement, and where possible, and if it so be, you might come across your poachers, and so you have to detain people or possibly undertake a civil arrest. If you're government, it's your job to go and investigate the crime scene, exhibit collection, you build your investigation, you interview witnesses, and you have to present your case to court through the prosecutor. So you also have to understand what's law of evidence. No matter who you are there, whether you're private or government, you need to understand that there's legislation that governs how evidence taken from a crime scene needs to be collected, handled, all the way through, analyzed, reports written, statements made, and then presented in court so that you can prove what was taken is what you're giving in court. All right, chain of custody are some of the concepts. So what's exhibits? What is evidence? Evidence is also testimony, verbal, me speaking, giving what I saw, what I heard, what I did, and then physical items. And physical items can be like the meat you saw there, it can be the snare that you saw there, or it can also be the photographs I took of people in the veld or whatever the case might be. So all of that is evidence. Okay. Then we have to ask ourselves, what's a crime scene? People often mistake a crime scene. When I ask you what's a crime scene, you might think, wow, there's blood and there's a carcass and that's that area. Well, it goes bigger than that. Even you can see there at the bottom that where you found that snare is a crime scene. There's exhibits there. There might be human DNA. There's cutting those wire. There was an implement used to cut the wire. So the implement becomes an exhibit. The wire becomes an exhibit. There might be footprints, etc. That campsite is filled with exhibits and evidence. So that's a crime scene. That area where you found the meat is a crime scene. The vehicle becomes a crime scene. And then ultimately the person becomes a crime scene. All right. In CITES, where we found, for instance, suitcases and boxes where they smuggle in content, the box itself becomes your crime scene. Okay. Not the whole airport, just that box. And it's important to understand what is a crime scene. Because it's so important, contamination is our biggest enemy. Now, contamination means you are either adding or taking something away from that crime scene. That's why things like wearing gloves or not stepping on just walking through a crime scene, but cordoning it off so that restricting people coming into that crime scene is critical, because you don't want to be accused of adding or contaminating your crime scene. Because if that's the problem, if that gets determined, whatever you found cannot be used in court. All right. So for me, guys, for you, the best thing I can tell you, because I can't do crime scene investigation, crime scene photography, criminal investigation. It's months of study and work that you have to go through. But what you can do very quickly is you know your legislation. Go and read up on these legislation. If you signed up to become a conservationist, then you need to know the law. That is just as simple as that. You need to know your rights. How many of you know your constitutional rights? And I mean honestly knowing it. What are your rights in terms of self-incrimination? What's your rights when you are arrested? What's your rights when you're questioned? Because you need to know your rights, because those rights are also the same rights for the suspect. And if you infringe on that, you're going to have a problem. And people are going to say, oh, but the person was intimidated, they were forced, whatever the case might be. So you need to know your constitutional rights. You need to understand that securing your crime scene is fundamentally important. Don't go fiddling around. Don't rush to what you think the crime scene is. People who know crime scenes would be able to tell you, oh, did you see that? Oh, did you notice that? And we need to take photographs of that, because all of that is exhibits. Remember, we need to link the person, the suspect, to the crime. It's critically important. And then also you will probably be required, not probably, you will be required to compile a statement on what you saw, what you heard, what you did, etc. So those are your basics, guys. And I think the most important, I want to highlight this again, know your South African legislation. Go read it up. And if you struggle understanding, phone a friend. I'm a friend, you can phone me, I'll help. Okay. If you're within the government environment where your responsibility is the investigation, these are some of the things that you need to do. All right. Now, if you look at that, when I studied at Technikon, you see how old I am, I just called it Technikon, University of Technology, that we didn't learn this. These are not subjects. These are law enforcement functions, crime scene management, compilation of a photo album, see expert statements, application for 205 records, consultation with veterinary services, previous convictions or your 69, serving subpoenas and summonses. You understand, there's so much. This is what it entails. Okay. It's one thing to detect the crime. It's one thing to catch people. It's another thing to find those people guilty. And we have to make sure that we find the right people guilty. So our job is objective. We have to say, if somebody you found caught and you cannot link them, you have to say, well, in that case, we need to set you free. We can't let innocent people be punished for crimes that they didn't commit. So we have to be absolutely sure and meticulous when we investigate. Okay. At the end of the day, how it all should fit together. So whatever your role is, let's say we work from a private environment where the crime is detected by you on the reserve, or either within a government protected area. Your crime scene management, the collection of evidence, all of these things start proving links. It starts making links to who is responsible and to prove that an illegal activity was conducted. So as you collect these exhibits and exhibits are analyzed, we then start making links potentially to where these people stay. So we do search warrants, execute search warrants at people's residence. We want to go see, obviously they're involved in crimes. So what other crimes did they commit in relation to the environment, and the exhibits are at home. And so there we find, for instance, more plants, more of these in CITES in the yard, and maybe some more meat in the fridges, etc. On the tools that they used, we start getting the fingerprints, so we can link them depending on where those tools were found. Can you link the tool to the crime? Slips, additional information. They stopped before they went there at the garage. They bought some stuff. Now one of them saying, oh, I don't know them at all. But you go to a garage, for instance, wherever that slip is from, you get the video footage, and there you can link them all together, casually walking up and down the aisles as they do their shopping. So you can say, well, technically you're lying, you do know each other. Ultimately, we want to link it to a person, to a suspect. Once we get to that stage, we start looking into the person, phone records, banking records, communication, for instance, overseas. Are they smuggling these things out of the country? get all sorts of warrants to look at their financial communications and transfers. And who knows, we might even identify a syndicate. But all of that is only possible if the first person at that crime scene did what they were meant to do, and they didn't contaminate that scene, because contamination will break all of these vital pieces of evidence, which means we can't ultimately find who's responsible, who else is involved. Okay, and again, I just want to end with that comment that I've left out a huge amount of information. I really tried to just skim over it to give you a sense of the biodiversity compliance and enforcement environment, as well as the legislation, how to read it, how it links back to your crime. And I hope I did that justice. And that's it for me. Thank you so much. Thank you, Johan and Jane.
We now open for questions and answers. And I would like to, I see Innocent put a question or a comment in the chat. Innocent, are you still in? Are you able to connect with us? Would you like to comment, perhaps switch on your mic and talk to us?
Hi.
Hi, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Innocent, please, just as you start, please tell us, where are you working? Where are you situated?
So I'm situated down in the Lowveld, in Sandringham Private Nature Reserve. So it's in between Timberwati and Thornybush. So I'm practically in the center of wildlife crime and poaching down here. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Please go ahead, ask your question.
It's not really a question. It's more of a advice to the students, and I've said it before. I've sometimes information. There's a lot of information out there, but without these talks, as students, I didn't know what do I need to study or where do I get information. So for me, just to give advice to the students, I did my CA grades, and doing those grades, it helped me a lot to gain some legal knowledge. And I also did still currently busy with a short course at UNISA. It's called Criminal Justice. It also helped me a lot to build on my knowledge. That's another thing the students can do after completing their conservation diploma or higher or advanced. And there's another course at UNISA. It's a long one. I think it's called, I wrote it down there in the comment section. So that's another short course that the students can do just to build up their legal knowledge, because not all of us are fortunate to end up in government, and some of us end up in the private sector, but then you can do those little courses to build up your legal knowledge. It will give you background, a little bit about the Constitution, Criminal Procedure Act, and if you do the other course that I've written down there in the comment section, it will give you a little bit of background into the legal, the environmental legislation of our country.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Innocent. We really appreciate that. So that's just, I think that's a fantastic tip in terms of just keep on educating yourself.
Yes.
In addition to the nature conservation diploma, please go, if you're going to work on the law enforcement side of conservation, look out for short courses that you can do. Also, Jane posted some links in the chat in terms of international modules that are available in terms of CITES. Also look at those. The better you understand these things, the better you can function in your work environment. Lewin, it's wonderful to have you back, and please ask your question. Thanks, Innocent.
Good morning. My question is, I saw that the logo of the Green Scorpions has that waste and pollution. In one of our communities that we're working with, which is in Palabora, in specific, Makushani village is full of litter. Who can we contact from the national department to assist us in the local communities? Thank you.
All right, thank you. 100%. You can mail me immediately if you want, and I'm sure my email address will be shared. I can also put it in the chat. From there, how it works is we attach a complaint number to it, and then we assign it to the local office. It'll probably go down to the local authority. If they don't react, we elevate it to the provincial authority. If the provincial authority don't react, then national reacts. But people will react long before that. So welcome to put those through to me. There's also a national environmental complaints hotline, and I'll make sure to share that information with everyone as well. Okay.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jacques. Cheryl.
Yes, thanks, Jane, and thanks, Jacques. Once again, it was another amazing session. This, being involved with law enforcement, going in this line, it takes a dedicated student. It's a totally different field, and it is linked, I'm not saying it's not, it's linked to environmental education, because you have to educate people pertaining to this. But Jacques, where I know Innocent did touch on it, but you know, from being a first and a second year student going into their practical year, what are the next steps a student can take? Would you say what is step number 4 or what is step number 2 on how to actually get involved in law enforcement? Because I know this is one of the students' passions, and they have to start somewhere, and they have to start grassroots, and they have to start from bottom up. So what is the next step these students can take?
Thanks, Cheryl. Yeah, look, I mean, to get into the compliance and enforcement field, in other words, to end up within the EMI environment, is directly after university or technicon, whatever you study, start educating yourself on the legislation. The more short courses you can do on environmental law, criminal law, etc., the better for yourselves. Because one interesting thing, the approach of South African government is you will not be required to be an EMI to get an EMI position. Okay. For that to happen, it means that the EMI basic training needs to become a commercial course, which we're never going to do. It's a legislated course, number one, and it's like becoming a police official. You go to the police college to become a police official. You're not a police official and then get a police official job. Okay. So at none of our government positions will you be required to have an EMI training to get the position. So you come in with your environmental background, your conservation. Look at me. I did nature conservation, but I investigate waste and pollution crimes, ocean and coast crimes, etc., etc. So once you get that position based on your qualification, then you are eligible to come for the EMI basic training. And that's done by myself and colleagues of me. We get everybody together twice a year. You do the course, you have to pass the course. After that, then you get designated and you start with your job. All right. I hope that makes sense. Cheryl, I think people must also be careful. There's, these fly-by-nights, quick fix kind of courses. Guys, be very careful of those. Do your homework, ask a friend, make sure, phone a lecturer, phone me, phone whoever, and just make sure, do you know about this course? I want to get into law enforcement. Is this a good one? And we can give you the pros and cons and say, be careful of this, because you don't want to go and invest your valuable time and money only to end up saying, wow, actually, I got taught the wrong thing, you understand? Or it's not really what I expected. So I hope that answers the question, too.
No, thank you. I agree. There are many fly-by-nights, and they're not accredited, and they charge a fortune. And people fall into their traps. But thanks, Jacques. I've taken a photograph of your email address, if you don't mind, and I will forward it on my group's WhatsApp. So thank you. And yeah, once again, Jane, thank you. I've learned a lot. And please stay dedicated, guys. Jacques, I've learned so much in all the years that I've known you, from when you were a student, when you came out to Suikerbos to try, and even when I was working for GDOD and we had some fun doing investigations. I don't forget that, because the way you educate, the way you work is very professional. And thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ogilvie. I just want to also put your attention on Jane Luke's comment in the chat. Prosecution is won or lost on the quality of the evidence. Kaylin, please ask your question.
Yeah, thanks, Jacques and Jane. Jacques, great to see you after so many years. I think for the students, it's so important to realize, as Dr. O and Jacques mentioned, it's so important to know your rights, no matter which part of conservation. I mean, conservation is such a big umbrella, and there's so many avenues that the students can choose to go down. No matter which avenue you choose to go down in conservation, it is of the utmost importance to know the legislation when it comes to environmental crimes and anything to do with the environment. In fact, what I find is a lot of students kind of, the ones that aren't interested in law enforcement, kind of put that legislation to a side. I'm not a policeman, I don't have to know about it. That is the worst mistake you could actually make. As Dr. Ogilvy mentioned, it has such an important role in education. No matter what you do, you are going to be the interface between the public and the environment. And if you don't know the legislation, you can't expect them to do and follow the right path. And it's your job as a conservationist to teach people about this legislation. I mean, I deal a lot with snare poaching in and around urban areas. That's one of my biggest. I mean, although that was never what I wanted to do, I found myself dealing with that a lot. And what I found is the extreme lack of knowledge in the public when it comes to subsistence poaching. They do not realize the seriousness of their actions. They do not realize what can be, what are the consequences of their actions. And it's our job as conservation specialists to inform the public, not just to go around arresting and persecuting or prosecuting people, but to inform them and give them the best amount, or the amount of knowledge to make the best decision in their life. So I think for students, that's the main thing I can say from my personal experiences. Doesn't matter where you are in conservation, you need to know the legislation. That needs to be priority, no matter what you're doing.
Even if you don't go into the field, you need to know the stuff. It's crucial.
Thanks, Kaylin. Thank you, Dr. Ogilvy. Jacques, are there any particular areas or a particular area where conservation practitioners are currently lacking or missing a step in the process of law enforcement that students should really pay attention to? That's perhaps where they miss, skip the steps, or where you find in the prosecution process then that if that was done, it would have succeeded, but constantly that's missing.
Look, knowing the law, I'm going to sound like a stuck record. If you don't know it, you're just going to make mistakes without even knowing you're making a mistake, and that's going to have an impact. And people are going to, and then people get upset, and law enforcement arrive, and they say, "Oh no, I gathered all of this. I cleaned there. I did that here." So, and then it's like, well, everything you did, to a large extent, makes that inadmissible. You understand? Something can be contaminated and yet be admissible, but there's a trial. They call it a trial within a trial process, where now you have to eliminate yourself from the crime scene, and there's ways of doing it, but it always leaves, let's say, a bitter taste in the mouth, and the court, I don't like it. Remember, we try, like I said, we don't want to put innocent people into trouble. We want to make sure. And how do you make sure? Is by not contaminating. So I think, know the law. At least number one, you need to know, is what I am looking at actually even a criminal offense? That's critically important. Sometimes people think, oh, that must be wrong. You'll be surprised. It might not be wrong. You understand? Or if it's wrong, why is it wrong? Do I need a permit? Do I need approval? Do I need permission? You need to understand that. So in a way to say, just understand, it's like COVID. Put it like way. People got upset. They wanted to do something, and what they were meant to do is stay at home. And that comment came up so many times. the best thing you can do for your fellow men and women is to stay at home and not come in contact with them to spread the disease. Similarly to a crime scene, the best you want to do is cordon it off and keep it secure. You don't want to go in there. That is probably the best thing you can do. And when you do have suspects, when you do have armed suspects, and when you catch them and you detain them, if you're in that position as within your protected area, keep them safe, keep them fed, give them water. Don't intimidate, don't get violent, don't go there. Don't go there. Because by doing things like that, you are yourself breaking the law. And by doing one, thinking you're doing a good thing, you're actually finding yourself on the other side of being the accused. Don't go there. All right. Treat people with respect, no matter who they are. You don't know their background. I've caught some really bad people in my life, and I treated them with respect. Okay. So the best thing you can do is protect the crime scene. When you have a suspect, detain them under very good, humane conditions. And then don't let them speak to each other. Don't let them start throwing exhibits away, etc. Make sure you contain them in a safe environment. That, for me, would probably be the best I can share in the limited time. Thanks.
Thank you, Jacques. That's very valuable. I would just like to draw the students' attention to next week's session, where we will be taking a closer look to crime scenes. Mr. Frick Rousseau from Sandparks, who is a senior investigator with Sandparks, he is going to be specifically looking at the crime scene scenario. So we'll take a deeper look at that next week. I don't see any further questions in the chat, and we've almost been busy
sorry, Johan, there's a student, Meswi.
Oh, wonderful. Mazwi, please go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, firstly, I'm an advanced student at TUT for Tier 1. I just want to ask the difference between an EMI and a police.
Thank you, Mazwi. Jacques, that's one for you.
So a police official is, we call it designated. Designated means there's a law that says a police official will be the following person. And then the minister of that regulates, or administrates that act, can designate an official to say, therefore, you are now a police official in terms of the Police Act. That's how it works. For the EMI, we've got the National Environmental Management Act. And in that act, it says the minister may designate an EMI who is, may designate an official to be an EMI who is a government employed official. All right. And there's a couple of rules there. So we are very similar, but designated, we get our powers, our function and our mandate from two separate pieces of legislation. But other than that, we have the similar powers. And as I said in the beginning, an EMI, we're not going to do murder, sexual assault, counterfeit goods, money laundering, all those, theft and robbery and all those kind of things. We may not investigate that. We may only investigate what is in our legislation, like the Biodiversity Act, the Waste Act, Air Pollution Act, Integrated Coastal Management Act, Water Act, those kind of environmental crimes we can investigate. I hope that makes sense. I try and keep it short. I'm not known for being a quick speaker.
Thank you very much. No, that's a very good summary. If there are no further questions, I'm really just going to thank our speakers this morning. Fantastic presentations. We really appreciate it. With Jane, it's really past the middle of the night at the moment. So Jane, sleep well. Thank you very much. Have a good rest. Jacques, I hope you have a busy and productive day. Thank you so much for your presentation. We really appreciate it. And please feel welcome to pop in the further sessions that we're going to have in this series. It would be fantastic to hear your comments as well.
And from my side, Jane, Jacques, thank you very much for enlightening my students. They will take this further, and I know it. I know when I see them again, they're going to say to me, this is the field they want to go in. So Jacques, please, you're going to be inundated. I already know that. I'm sorry. Kaylin, I know you've already been inundated. I'm sorry. But these kids can make a difference. And You guys have impressed me. And Jane, thank you very much. And thanks for having a little bit of less sleep. And I really do appreciate it. And if you can put your email address, I can contact you as well, because there's 1 or 2 questions I want to ask which way further as well. But thank you. Thank you very much, guys. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Have a brilliant day. Thank you. Bye-bye.